The carriage accident had claimed them both, father and brother, duke and heir, all in a single rain-slicked evening 8 months ago. And now Tempest, Edmund's beloved stallion, was about to kill the only Ridley man left standing. Clara Brennan watched from the shadow of the stable archway as the new Duke of Northmoor circled the black horse with the careful movements of a man approaching a loaded pistol. Tempest's ears flattened against his skull. His hooves struck the paddock dirt in sharp, violent rhythms that spoke of grief Clara recognized too well. She shouldn't be here. The head groom had made that clear when he'd caught her watching yesterday. His Grace don't need gawkers while he's working his brother's horse, miss. But Clara wasn't gawking. She was reading the animal's body language the way her father had taught her, the tension in the hindquarters, the whites of the eyes, the breath coming too fast through flared nostrils. The Duke wasn't working the horse. He was mourning near it. "Easy, boy," Callum Ridley murmured, extending one gloved hand. His voice carried across the paddock, low, careful, edged with something that might have been pleading. "It's only me. You know me," Tempest screamed. The sound tore through the morning air, raw and accusatory. The stallion reared, front hooves slashing at empty air, and Callum stumbled backward. His boot caught on a stone. He went down hard. Clara moved before thought caught up to instinct. She vaulted the paddock fence in a single motion, her worn skirts tangling around her legs as she landed between the fallen Duke and 1,500 pounds of grieving animal. Tempest's hooves came down inches from Callum's shoulder. Clara didn't flinch. She simply stood there, utterly still, and began to hum. Not a melody, just a low, rhythmic sound that matched the pattern of her breathing. Her father had done this with wounded horses, with animals who'd forgotten that humans could be gentle. The trick wasn't to impose calm, it was to offer it as a choice. Tempest's head swung toward her, his nostrils flared, testing her scent. Clara kept humming, kept breathing. Behind her, she heard the Duke scramble to his feet, but she didn't turn. All her attention remained on the horse's dark, intelligent eyes. "You miss him," she whispered, so quietly the words were nearly lost beneath the humming. I know you do." The stallion's ears swiveled forward, one small shift in a body still coiled with tension, but it was enough. Clara took a single step closer, then another. Tempest's breath warmed her outstretched palm. He didn't lower his head to sniff her hand, not yet, but he didn't retreat either. "What the devil do you think you're doing?" The Duke's voice cracked like a whip. Tempest flinched, and Clara's hand shot up in a sharp gesture that demanded silence. To her shock, Callum Ridley obeyed. The Duke of Northmoor, one of the wealthiest men in England, actually stopped speaking because a horse trainer's daughter had told him to. She waited until Tempest's breathing slowed before she turned around. The Duke stood 10 feet away, his usually immaculate appearance in disarray. Mud streaked his riding coat. His dark hair had fallen across his forehead, and his grey eyes— no, she wouldn't think about his eyes. She'd spent too many months carefully not noticing the way they shadowed when he visited her father's modest training yard, back when he'd been the spare heir with time for such things. "You could have been killed," he said flatly. "So could you. That's different. Because you're a duke?" She heard the edge in her own voice and hated it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with creditors circling her inherited property like crows over a carcass. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but nobility doesn't make you immune to being trampled." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "I meant because he's my responsibility." "Then take better responsibility." The words escaped before she could stop them. Clara's cheeks burned. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "But accurate." Callum's gaze shifted past her to Tempest, who stood watching them both with wary attention. "You calmed him. In seconds, you did what I haven't managed in 8 months. There was no accusation in his tone, only a hollow kind of wonder that made Clara's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. She understood loss. Her father had died 3 years ago, and some mornings she still turned toward his empty chair before remembering. "I didn't calm him, Your Grace. I just stopped being a threat." "I'm not—" He cut himself off, ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Edmund raised him from a foal. Tempest would follow him anywhere, do anything he asked. After the accident, I thought the horse would accept me eventually. That he'd understand I'm not the one he's waiting for." Callum's jaw tightened. For a moment, Clara thought he might order her off his property for the presumption. Instead, he simply nodded. "I can't destroy him," he said quietly. "Edmund loved this animal. It's the only gift I ever gave my brother that he truly valued. But keeping him like this, dangerous, suffering," the Duke's voice caught. He cleared his throat roughly. "I've tried everything. Every trainer in the county, and half those beyond it. They all say the same thing: he's too far gone." Clara looked back at Tempest. The stallion had lowered his head slightly, his ears still forward, still focused on her, with an intensity that spoke of intelligence rather than madness. She saw what the trainers had missed, not a broken animal, but one trapped in grief with no way to express it. "He's not gone," she said. "He's just alone. Miss Brennan." The formal address startled her. She hadn't realized he knew her name, but of course he did. Before his father and brother died, before he'd inherited a dukedom he'd never wanted, Callum Ridley had sometimes accompanied Edmund to her father's training yard. He'd watched her work with difficult horses, while Edmund and her father discussed bloodlines. He'd never spoken to her. Spare heirs didn't acknowledge women of her station, but he'd watched. "Your Grace? Can you help him?" The question hung between them, weighted with more than animal husbandry. Clara understood what he was really asking. "Can you do what I cannot? Can you reach the last piece of my brother I have left? Can you succeed where I've failed?" She should say no. Should recognize the danger in getting entangled with aristocratic grief and impossible expectations. Should remember that the last time she'd let herself care about someone above her station, it had ended with a broken engagement and village gossip that still followed her like smoke. Instead, she looked at the Duke's shadowed eyes and heard herself say, "I can try." Relief crossed his face so quickly she almost missed it. "Name your price." 3 weeks, Clara said, calculating rapidly. 3 weeks to train Tempest enough to satisfy the Duke. 3 weeks of wages that might, just might, be enough to hold off the creditors threatening to seize her father's land. "I'll need full access to the stables and exclusive handling. No one else works with him during that time." "Done." "And I work in my own way. No interference, no scheduled demands, no—" "I said done, Miss Brennan." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "You're negotiating with a man who just tried to bribe half of England's horse trainers and failed. I'm in no position to dictate terms." She knew she should accept gracefully, should curtsy and retreat before he reconsidered. But pride, that damned, dangerous pride her father had always warned her about, made her add, "One more thing, Your Grace. When I succeed, you'll provide a written reference for my services, not as a favor, as payment earned." His smile faded. For a long moment, he simply studied her with those unsettling grey eyes that seemed to see past her carefully maintained composure. "You won't need a reference, Miss Brennan. If you can reach Tempest, every aristocrat in England will hear of it." He paused. "But yes, you have my word." Clara inclined her head, not quite a curtsy. Behind her, Tempest shifted his weight, testing whether this strange peace between the humans would hold. "I'll start tomorrow at dawn," she said. "You'll start now." The Duke gestured toward the stable complex. "You said you need exclusive access. My head groom will show you to quarters near the main stables. Your things can be sent for." "That's not necessary." "It is if you're to succeed in 3 weeks." Something harder entered his voice, the ducal authority he usually kept sheathed. "Tempest is stabled here. You'll need to be near him at all hours to build trust, unless your pride objects to accepting my hospitality." The barb landed cleanly. Clara's cheeks flamed, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "My pride objects to being manipulated, Your Grace, but my common sense recognizes a practical arrangement when it's offered." "Then we understand each other." He moved toward the paddock gate, favoring his right leg slightly where Tempest had nearly crushed it. 3 weeks, Miss Brennan. Make them count." He was halfway to the manor house before Clara realized what she'd agreed to. 3 weeks living on ducal property. 3 weeks under the observation of servants who would report every misstep to their employer. 3 weeks trying to heal an animal's grief while managing her own complicated feelings about the man who'd hired her. She'd escaped village gossip by burying herself in work after the broken engagement. Now she was walking straight back into the kind of scrutiny that had nearly destroyed her. Tempest nickered softly behind her. Clara turned to find the stallion watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes, waiting to see if she'd prove herself another disappointment. "You and me both," she murmured, approaching slowly with one hand extended. "Let's see if we can figure this out together." The horse didn't lower his head to her palm, but he didn't bolt either, and for now that would have to be enough. The servants' quarters were nicer than her own cottage. Clara stood in the small but immaculately maintained room and tried not to let the comparison sting. A narrow bed with clean linens, a washstand with actual hot water available from the kitchen, a writing desk positioned beneath the window that overlooked the stable yard. Her cottage had none of these things. It had leaks she couldn't afford to repair and a winter draft that no amount of rags could stop. It had memories of her father in every corner and debt notices stacked on the kitchen table. She couldn't lose it. Couldn't let the creditors take the only thing that proved Thomas Brennan had existed, had mattered, had built something with his own hands. "Miss Brennan." Clara turned from the window to find a young housemaid standing in the doorway, arms full of linens. "His Grace sent word you're to have fresh towels daily, and Cook wants to know your preferences for meals. She says you're to eat proper while you're here, not just stable scraps." The casual kindness made Clara's throat tight. She'd grown too accustomed to managing alone, to expecting nothing from anyone. "Please thank Cook for her thoughtfulness. Whatever's convenient for the household will suit me fine." The maid, Annie, Clara remembered from her father's occasional dealings with the estate, smiled warmly. "Begging your pardon, miss, but that's not how things work here. Not since His Grace took over, anyway. He's very particular about people being treated proper." She set the linens on the bed. "We're all glad you've come. That poor beast in the stables. It breaks your heart, hearing him cry at night." Clara's attention sharpened. "He cries?" "Every night around midnight. Starts calling out like he's looking for someone. Wakes half the house, it does. His Grace goes down to the stables sometimes, tries to settle him, but—" Annie shook her head. "The horse won't let him close, just gets more agitated. And no one else has tried. Lord Edmund was the only one Tempest ever really took to. The head groom can manage the basics, feeding, mucking out, but barely. We've had 3 stable hands quit in the past 2 months after the horse went after them." Annie lowered her voice. "There's talk in the village that the animal's cursed, that Lord Edmund's spirit lives in him now, angry about the accident. Superstitious nonsense. But Clara understood how grief could look like possession to people who'd never learned to read its language. Tempest isn't cursed, he's mourning. There's a difference. That's what His Grace says too." Annie moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Brennan, I know it's not my place, but be careful down there at night. The horse isn't the only danger. Lord Victor's been staying at the estate more often lately, and he has friends who drink too much and wander where they shouldn't." Lord Victor. The Duke's cousin and, if rumours were accurate, next in line for the title should anything happen to Callum. Clara had seen him around the property occasionally, a handsome man with the kind of easy charm that put her instinctively on guard. "I'll be careful," she promised. After Annie left, Clara unpacked the small bag she'd brought, 2 changes of clothes, her father's training journal, a handful of herbs she used to calm anxious animals. Then she stood at the window watching the stable yard until the shadows lengthened toward evening. She should rest. Should prepare for tomorrow's work with Tempest. Instead, she found herself drawn back toward the stables as twilight settled over the estate. The main stable was a long, beautifully maintained structure that smelled of fresh hay and leather and horse. Clara moved quietly past the stalls, housing the estate's regular stock: riding horses, carriage teams, a few breeding mares. At the far end, separated from the others by a wide corridor, she found Tempest. The stallion stood in a stall twice the size of the others, his black coat gleaming in the lamplight. He'd been groomed recently. Someone was still caring for his basic needs despite the danger. But tension radiated from every line of his body. His head came up as Clara approached, ears flattening in warning. "Just me," she said softly. "I'm not here to demand anything. Just wanted to see how you're settling for the night." Tempest snorted, pawed the straw bedding with one front hoof. Clara leaned against the stall door, careful to keep her body language open and non-threatening. "Annie says you call for him at midnight. Lord Edmund, I mean. I don't suppose you understand that he can't come back, do you?" The horse's ears swiveled toward her voice, not relaxing exactly, but listening. "My father died 3 years ago," Clara continued, surprised by her own willingness to speak the words aloud. "Heart gave out while he was training a young mare. He was gone before I could reach him. For months afterward, I kept setting 2 places at the table. Kept expecting to hear his voice calling me in from the yard." She swallowed past the tightness in her throat. "It doesn't help, knowing they're gone. The heart keeps waiting anyway." Tempest lowered his head slightly, watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Lord Edmund must have loved you very much," Clara said. "The Duke, his brother, he's trying to honor that. I think he's failing because he doesn't know how to grieve properly himself, lost too much too quickly, and now he's just holding on to whatever pieces remain." She wasn't sure if she was still talking about the horse. Footsteps echoed from the stable entrance. Clara straightened, instinctively moving away from Tempest's stall as Callum Ridley appeared at the end of the corridor. He'd changed from his mud-stained riding clothes into evening wear, dark coat, pristine cravat, boots polished to a mirror shine. The transformation back to ducal perfection should have created distance. Instead, it only highlighted the shadows beneath his eyes. "Miss Brennan, I didn't expect to find you here so late. I wanted to check on him before bed." She gestured toward Tempest. "Annie mentioned he's been restless at night." "Restless?" Callum's mouth twisted. "A diplomatic description. He sounds like he's being tortured, and there's nothing I can—" He stopped himself, shook his head. "Forgive me. You don't need to hear this. You hired me to help him, Your Grace. Understanding his behavior at all hours is part of that work. Then perhaps you should know the full extent of the problem." He moved closer to Tempest's stall, though he kept careful distance from the bars. "Around midnight he begins calling, screaming really. It lasts anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. Nothing calms him during these episodes. I've tried staying with him, talking to him, even playing music. Edmund used to play violin in the stables sometimes, claimed it soothed the horses." Clara's mind caught on the image. The younger Ridley brother playing violin for his beloved horse, while the rest of the aristocracy attended their balls and dinners. It fit with her memories of Edmund, gentle, unconventional, more comfortable in stables than drawing rooms. "Did it work?" she asked. "The music?" "For Tempest, yes. The other horses would settle too." Callum's voice softened. "My brother had a gift for finding beauty in unexpected places. He never cared much for society's expectations, used to drive our father mad." The affection in his tone was unmistakable. Whatever complicated feelings Callum had harbored toward the old Duke, his love for Edmund ran clear and deep. "You said you didn't get along with your father," Clara said carefully, testing the boundaries of their conversation. "I respected him." "That's not the same as liking him." Callum turned from the stall to face her directly. The late Duke believed in duty above all else, propriety, tradition. Edmund believed in joy. They clashed constantly over the smallest things, music in the stables, befriending grooms and horse trainers instead of eligible ladies, giving an expensive thoroughbred to— He stopped abruptly. Color touched his cheekbones. "To?" Clara prompted. "To the stable master's daughter," Callum finished quietly. "That was the original plan. Edmund wanted to give Tempest to your father's protege as a breeding stallion, said true horsemanship deserved rewarding, regardless of station." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd known Edmund had been kind, had appreciated her father's work, but she'd never imagined— "My father would never have accepted such a gift," she managed. "I know. Edmund knew too, but he wanted to make the gesture anyway. Wanted Thomas Brennan to understand how much he valued his expertise." Callum's gaze held hers. "Then the accident happened, and Edmund never got the chance." They stood in silence, the weight of all those unfinished intentions heavy between them. In his stall, Tempest shifted restlessly, as if sensing the humans' shared grief. "I should let you rest," Callum said finally. "Tomorrow will be demanding." He was halfway down the corridor when Clara found her voice. "Your Grace?" He paused, but didn't turn. Edmund sounds like he was a good man, the kind of person this world needs more of. She hesitated, then added, I think he'd be glad his brother is fighting so hard to protect what he loved. Callum's shoulders tensed. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it. I hope you're right, Miss Brennan, because I've failed at nearly everything else since becoming Duke. He left before she could reply. Clara stood alone in the stable, listening to Tempest's restless movements and wondering what exactly she'd walked into. This wasn't just about training a difficult horse. It was about grief and guilt and two men, one living, one dead, who'd loved an animal that now served as the last fragile connection between them. And somehow, impossibly, she'd agreed to navigate all of it in just 3 weeks. Midnight came with the precision of a clock, striking the hour. Clara woke from uneasy sleep to the sound she'd been expecting. Tempest's screaming cry echoing across the stable yard. She was out of bed and dressed in seconds, her fingers fumbling with bootlaces in the dark. By the time she reached the stables, lamplight already glowed from the corridor. Callum stood outside Tempest's stall in shirt sleeves and hastily donned trousers, his hair mussed from sleep. He didn't seem surprised to see her. I tried to warn you. The stallion's cries were worse than Clara had imagined. Not the angry screams from earlier, but something rawer, a sound of pure, inconsolable loss. Tempest paced his stall in tight circles, head high, calling and calling for someone who would never answer. How long has this been happening? She asked. Since the first week after the accident. Every night, same time. Callum's jaw was tight. The veterinarians say there's nothing physically wrong with him. It's just this. Clara approached the stall slowly. Has anyone tried staying with him through it? I have, multiple times. It makes no difference. Sometimes it seems to agitate him more. She believed him. But she also believed that whoever had tried hadn't known the right way to offer comfort to a grieving animal. Her father had taught her that lesson with a mare who'd lost her foal. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply witness pain without trying to fix it. I'm going in, she said. Absolutely not. He's dangerous when... Clara was already unlatching the stall door. She slipped inside before Callum could physically stop her, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Tempest spun toward her, eyes rolling white, hooves striking the straw. She didn't try to touch him, didn't speak or hum or offer false comfort. She simply sat down in the corner of the stall, drew her knees to her chest, and let the horse's anguish wash over her. Miss Brennan, trust me, she said softly, not taking her eyes off Tempest. Please, Your Grace, just trust me. She heard Callum's sharp intake of breath, heard him move closer to the stall door, ready to intervene. But he didn't demand she leave. Tempest circled the stall twice more, his cries gradually diminishing to sharp, distressed whinnies. Each time he passed Clara's corner, his gaze flickered toward her, registering her presence but not yet understanding what it meant. Clara kept her breathing steady, kept her body still and unthreatening, let the silence between the horse's cries grow longer, more frequent. You're allowed to miss him, she murmured finally. You're allowed to be angry that he left. I was angry at my father for dying for weeks afterward, angry that he'd left me alone with all these responsibilities I didn't know how to carry. Tempest's ears swiveled toward her voice, but eventually I realized he didn't choose to go. He would have stayed if he could have, just like Lord Edmund would have stayed for you if the choice had been his. The stallion stopped pacing, stood trembling in the center of the stall, sides heaving with exhaustion. Clara rose slowly to her feet, kept her hands at her sides, non-threatening. I can't bring him back, no one can, but I can promise you this, you won't be alone with it anymore. The missing, the waiting, I'll be here. She took one step toward Tempest, then another. The horse's muscles tensed, ready to bolt or attack. Clara paused. I see you, she whispered. I see how much it hurts. And it's all right. You don't have to be all right yet. Tempest's head lowered fractionally. His breathing began to slow. When Clara extended her hand this time, palm up, the stallion didn't strike or retreat. He simply stood there, trembling, letting her move closer. Her fingertips brushed his velvet nose. Tempest flinched but held his ground. Clara flattened her palm against his muzzle, feeling the heat of his breath, the rapid flutter of his pulse beneath warm skin. Good boy, she breathed. Such a good, brave boy. The horse's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, something in them had shifted. Not healed, not whole, but perhaps fractionally less alone. Clara stayed with him until his trembling eased, until his breathing matched hers in a slow, steady rhythm. When she finally turned to leave the stall, she found Callum still standing vigil outside, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. He's settled for now, she said quietly, latching the door behind her. But he'll do this again tomorrow night, and the night after, until he learns that his grief won't destroy him. How do you know? Because that's how grief works, Your Grace. You have to survive it enough times before you start believing you can. Something flickered across Callum's face, recognition perhaps, or pain. You stayed in there for 40 minutes. He could have killed you at any point. But he didn't. That's not... He stopped, shook his head. You're right. He didn't. For the first time in 8 months, someone was in that stall during one of his episodes, and he didn't attack. Clara could feel the Duke's gaze on her, intent and searching. She kept her own eyes fixed on Tempest, unwilling to examine what she might find if she looked at Callum directly. You should rest, she said. Tomorrow I'll begin the actual training. This was just establishing trust. Miss Brennan. His voice stopped her as she turned to leave. Thank you. The simple words, spoken without ducal formality or aristocratic distance, did something dangerous to Clara's carefully guarded heart. She nodded without trusting herself to speak, and fled toward her quarters. Behind her she heard Callum murmur something to Tempest, too quiet for her to make out the words. But the tone carried clearly enough. Grief, gratitude, and perhaps, underneath it all, the first fragile thread of hope. The rumor reached Clara on her 3rd day at the estate. She was working with Tempest in the paddock, just standing near him, letting him grow accustomed to her presence in daylight as well as during his midnight episodes, when she heard the stable hands' voices drifting from the tack room. Unnatural is what it is. Woman like that taming a beast no man could manage. Victor's been asking questions about her. Says the Duke's judgment might be impaired. Impaired how? Think about it. First, he refuses to put down a dangerous animal. Now he's got some nobody living on the property. Given her free run of the stables, people are talking. Clara's hands stilled on the lead rope she'd been coiling. She should announce her presence, should make it clear she'd heard their gossip. Instead, she stood frozen, listening to her worst fears given voice. The Duke's not thinking with his head anymore, the first voice continued. That's what Victor says. Says Callum Ridley used to be the sensible one. Now look at him. So obsessed with a dead man's horse and paying attention to a woman who's got no business being here. The words shouldn't have hurt. Clara had heard worse after her broken engagement, when the vicar's son had decided she wasn't suitable wife material after all. But something about hearing her presence here reduced to scandal, to evidence of the Duke's impaired judgment. That's enough. Callum's voice cut through the gossip like a blade. Clara heard the stable hands scrambling to their feet, stammering apologies. She should move, should pretend she'd been elsewhere, but pride kept her rooted in place. Miss Brennan is here at my explicit invitation, the Duke said coldly. She is doing work that every other trainer in this county failed to accomplish. If anyone, and I mean anyone, has questions about my judgment in hiring her, they're welcome to take their concerns to me directly. Is that understood? Yes, Your Grace. Sorry, Your Grace? Footsteps retreated hastily. Clara waited until silence fell before leading Tempest back toward his stall. The horse followed docilely, 3 days of patient work beginning to show results, but her mind was elsewhere. People were talking. Of course they were. A common woman living on ducal property, working closely with the new Duke, achieving results that seemed almost supernatural. The ton lived for such scandals, and Lord Victor was asking questions. Clara secured Tempest in his stall and turned to find Callum waiting in the corridor. He'd changed from whatever formal attire he'd been wearing to riding clothes, though the rigid set of his shoulders suggested the conversation with the stable hands had occurred recently. You didn't need to defend me, she said before he could speak. I wasn't defending you. I was stating facts. Facts that will now be repeated in every servants' hall and country house drawing room within 50 miles. Clara crossed her arms. Lord Victor is your cousin, yes? Next in line for the title. Callum's expression shuttered. What does that have to do with anything? He's been asking questions about me, about your judgment. That's what the stable hand said. She met his gaze directly. If he's trying to discredit you, Your Grace, having me here makes it easier. Let me worry about Victor. I can't do that. Not when my presence is being used against you. Your presence, Callum said slowly, is the only reason I haven't given up entirely on Tempest. On everything Edmund left behind. Do you understand that? The raw honesty in his voice made Clara's breath catch. She understood too well the way grief could narrow your world to a single point of focus, the way a small victory could become the only thing keeping you functional. I understand you're exhausted, she said gently. I understand you're carrying more than one person should. But Your Grace, Callum, she stopped, shocked by her own use of his given name. If your cousin is actively working to undermine you, we need to be careful. Both of us. Something shifted in his expression. You called me Callum. I apologize. That was... Don't. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines of strain around his eyes. Don't apologize for treating me like a person instead of a title. Trust me, I need more of that. They stood in the stable corridor, close enough that Clara could smell horse and leather, and something distinctly him, soap and wool and exhaustion. Her pulse kicked up in warning. This was dangerous. This intimacy, this unexpected connection forming between a duke and a horse trainer's daughter. Victor arrived this morning, Callum said quietly. He's brought guests from London. Members of the council, he claims, though I suspect his motives are less than pure. What council? A gentleman's club that technically has no power but practically controls half the duchy's business interests. If they believe I'm unfit to manage my responsibilities... He trailed off. Clara's stomach dropped. They could what? Challenge your title? Not directly, but they could make it impossible for me to function as duke. Freeze accounts, block appointments, pressure the crown to intervene. Callum's jaw tightened. Victor's been suggesting for months that grief has made me irrational, that I need guidance, protection from my own poor decisions, like keeping Tempest. Like keeping Tempest, like hiring you, like refusing to attend society events, or participate in the marriage market, or behave like a proper duke should. Bitterness crept into his tone. Apparently mourning my father and brother for more than the appropriate mourning period constitutes instability. Clara thought of the midnight vigils, the careful distance Callum maintained from the servants, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleep, lost to grief. You're not unstable. You're human. That's not acceptable for a duke. Then maybe the problem isn't you, Your Grace. Maybe it's what's expected of you. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. You sound like Edmund. He used to say the aristocracy was a gilded cage, and the only sane response was to rattle the bars until someone noticed. The laughter died. And now he's gone, and I'm left trying to figure out if he was right. Clara understood then, truly understood, what she was looking at. Not just a grieving man, but one caught between honoring his brother's unconventional beliefs and fulfilling the role his birth demanded. Torn between duty and authenticity, between what society expected and what his heart needed. Your Grace, she said carefully, if Lord Victor is here with witnesses from this council, you need to be careful. Every decision you make will be scrutinized, including your association with me. I know. Then perhaps, no. The word was flat, final. I won't send you away. Not when you're finally making progress with Tempest. Not when you're the only person who seems to understand what I'm trying to protect. Even if it costs you everything else. Callum met her gaze steadily. Edmund sacrificed his reputation dozens of times to protect what he believed in. I owe him at least one sacrifice of my own. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they filled Clara with creeping dread. Because she knew how these stories ended. The commoner caught between aristocratic power struggles, blamed and discarded when convenient. She'd promised herself never to be that woman again. I have 2 weeks left on our contract, she said quietly. Let me focus on completing it. Let me give you something tangible to show these council members. A horse trained, a problem solved. That's harder to question than intentions. And after the 2 weeks? Clara didn't let herself consider the question too closely. After that, Your Grace, You'll have your reference letter and I'll have my fee. Clean. Professional. Nothing for your cousin to twist into scandal. Callum's expression darkened. You think I'd let Victor destroy your reputation? I think your cousin is next in line for a dukedom. I think he's watching for any weakness he can exploit. And I think you underestimate how easily a woman like me becomes collateral damage. She regretted the words immediately. Callum stepped back as if she'd struck him, and something wounded flickered across his face before the ducal mask slammed back into place. Forgive me, Miss Brennan. I didn't realize you viewed your position here as quite so precarious. That's not what I meant. I believe you have work to attend to, as do I. He inclined his head in a gesture that was all formality, all aristocratic distance. I'll ensure the servants are reminded to treat you with appropriate respect. You won't be troubled by gossip again. He left before she could explain, before she could clarify that she wasn't afraid of him, but of the situation he represented, of getting close enough to care and then being inevitably, predictably hurt. In his stall, Tempest whinnied softly. Clara leaned against the bars, pressing her forehead to the cool wood. I'm an idiot, she told the horse. I just pushed away the one person in this entire estate who's been nothing but kind to me. Tempest's soft snuffle sounded almost like agreement. That night, when midnight came and the stallion's cries began, Clara returned to the stables to find them empty. No lamplight, no Duke standing vigil. She worked with Tempest alone, soothing him through the episode until he settled, and tried not to acknowledge the ache of disappointment beneath her ribs. She'd wanted distance, she'd gotten it. So why did it feel like loss? Lord Victor Ashworth was handsome in the way of men who'd never had to develop personality, all symmetrical features and practiced charm, and eyes that calculated while his mouth smiled. Clara disliked him on sight. He appeared in the stable yard on her 5th morning, accompanied by 2 gentlemen in expensive riding clothes and an air of entitled boredom. Clara was working Tempest on a lead line, teaching him to respond to verbal commands again, when their voices interrupted her concentration. Remarkable, Victor drawled. The infamous Miss Brennan and her miraculous horse taming. Gentlemen, observe. My cousin's latest obsession. Clara forced herself to continue working, keeping her attention on Tempest, even as her skin prickled with awareness. The stallion's ears flattened slightly, sensing her tension. Easy, she murmured. Just ignore them. Does it speak? One of Victor's companions, a florid man with thinning hair, laughed at his own wit. Or is the charm purely visual? Victor's smile sharpened. Miss Brennan, allow me to introduce Lord Hardwicke and Sir James Sutton. They're members of the Gentlemen's Council for Duchy Affairs, here to assess the estate's management. Translation: here to find evidence that Callum was unfit. Clara turned to face them, keeping the lead rope slack to avoid spooking Tempest. Gentlemen. The horse seems remarkably calm, Sir James observed. We were told it was dangerous. He was grieving, Clara corrected. Not dangerous. There's a difference. Was? Lord Hardwicke raised an eyebrow. You speak as if the problem's solved. I speak as if progress has been made. She kept her tone professional, neutral. Tempest is learning to trust again. That takes time. Victor moved closer, circling her and the horse with predatory interest. How much time, Miss Brennan? And at what cost to my cousin's reputation? Surely you understand how this looks, a duke so desperate to preserve his dead brother's horse that he'll hire anyone regardless of their suitability. The insult was carefully crafted, not quite direct enough to warrant confrontation, but clear in its implication. She was unsuitable, unworthy, a symbol of Callum's failing judgment. I was hired based on my expertise with difficult horses, Clara said evenly. His Grace reviewed my qualifications and determined I was the most suitable candidate. Unless you're suggesting the Duke of Northmoor is incapable of making sound professional decisions. Victor's smile didn't waver, but something cold entered his eyes. I'm suggesting that grief can cloud even the soundest judgment. Wouldn't you agree? I'd agree that dismissing someone's capabilities based on their station rather than their results is poor judgment. Lord Hardwicke coughed. Spirited girl. Woman, Clara corrected before she could stop herself. I'm 27 years old, my lord, hardly a girl. The silence that followed felt dangerous, Clara could practically see Victor calculating how to use her boldness against her, against Callum. She'd played directly into his hands by responding instead of demurring politely. "Where is my cousin this morning?" Victor asked, his tone deceptively casual. One would think he'd want to supervise such important work personally. "His Grace has estate business to attend to," Clara replied. "He trusts me to work independently." "How convenient." Victor's gaze dropped meaningfully to where she stood alone with the horse. "Such trust, such intimacy of arrangement. I'm sure society will find it all quite fascinating when word spreads." The threat was barely veiled. Clara felt her pulse kick up, felt Tempest's tension mirror her own through the lead rope. She needed to end this conversation before it escalated further. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have training to complete. Tempest requires consistency in his schedule." "Of course." Victor inclined his head in a mockery of courtesy. "We wouldn't want to interfere with my cousin's priorities." "Calm, gentlemen. I believe we've seen quite enough." They left with Victor's laughter echoing across the yard. Clara stood trembling with suppressed anger, her hands tight on the lead rope, until Tempest nickered and pushed his nose against her shoulder. "I know," she whispered. "I made it worse, didn't I?" The horse had no answers, but when she led him back to his stall, she noticed Callum watching from the manor house window. Even at this distance, she could read the tension in his posture. He'd witnessed the entire encounter, and he'd done nothing to intervene. The realization shouldn't have stung. Clara had told him she wanted professional distance, had insisted on treating their arrangement as purely transactional, but some treacherous part of her had hoped, what? That he'd defend her honor? Storm down to the stables and confront his cousin? Risk his already precarious position for a woman he barely knew? She was a fool for even imagining it. That afternoon, Clara received a note delivered by Annie. The handwriting was masculine, precise. "Miss Brennan, please join me for tea in the library at 4 o'clock. We need to discuss Victor's visit and its implications." Northmore, not Callum. Not even a personal signature. Just his title, formal and distant. Clara arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, her second-best dress hastily pressed, her hair arranged in a simple knot. The library was a magnificent room, floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather chairs, windows overlooking the rose garden. Callum stood by the fireplace in afternoon dress, looking every inch the Duke. "Miss Brennan, thank you for coming." She curtsied, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place she was in this elegant space. "Your Grace, please sit." He gestured to one of the chairs. Tea had been laid out with formal precision. Porcelain cups, small sandwiches, delicate pastries she wouldn't have known how to eat properly. Clara perched on the edge of her chair, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Callum poured tea with careful attention, handed her a cup she accepted without drinking. The silence stretched between them, waited with everything unsaid. "I saw Victor's visit this morning," he said finally. "I apologize for not intervening." "You don't need to apologize for strategic decisions, Your Grace." "Callum." The correction was quiet but firm. "When we're alone, please, I need at least one person who sees me as a person rather than a title." Clara's resolve wavered. "That's not wise." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." He set down his own untouched cup. "Victor is escalating. This morning was a calculated attempt to provoke you into responding emotionally, so he could use it as evidence of my poor judgment. Then I gave him exactly what he wanted. No, you defended yourself with dignity and precision. Hardwick and Sutton were impressed whether they admitted it or not." A ghost of a smile touched Callum's mouth. "Victor, on the other hand, looked murderous. Which means you won that particular exchange. Winning doesn't matter if he has the power to destroy your reputation. He only has that power if I give it to him." Callum leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Miss Brennan, Clara, I need you to understand something. I'm not some naive fool who doesn't recognize the risks. I know what Victor is attempting. I know how precarious my position has become. But I'm choosing to trust my own judgment anyway." "Why?" The question burst out before she could contain it. "Why risk so much for a horse for someone like me?" "Because Edmund would have." The words were simple, devastating. "Because the last conversation I had with my brother, the night before he died, He asked me if I was happy with the life our father had planned for me. I said I didn't have a choice. He said there's always a choice, I just had to be brave enough to make it. Callum's voice roughened. Then he died, and I inherited everything he'd tried to escape. And I realized he was right. There is always a choice. I can be the Duke my father wanted, rigid, traditional, emotionally distant, or I can try to be the man Edmund believed I could be. And what kind of man is that? Someone who protects what he loves, even when it's inconvenient. Someone who values character over station. Someone who— He stopped, shook his head. Someone who stops hiding behind duty and starts living by conviction. Clara's heart was doing dangerous things in her chest. That sounds exhausting. It is. He smiled, genuinely this time, but less so when I'm not doing it alone. The implication hung in the air between them. Clara knew she should deflect, should retreat to professional boundaries. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What do you need from me in practical terms?" Callum straightened, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Continue working with Tempest. Make as much progress as possible in the next 9 days. Victor is organizing a demonstration for the council members. He wants to prove the horse is still dangerous, still a liability. If you can show them otherwise—" "It might not be enough," Clara warned. 9 days isn't long to undo 8 months of trauma. "I know, but it's what we have." He paused. "There's something else. Victor's been asking questions about your background, your family, your—" He hesitated. "My broken engagement?" Clara finished flatly. Surprise flickered across his face. "You knew he was investigating you." "I assumed. It's what I would do if I were trying to discredit someone." She set down her untouched tea. "The vicar's son proposed 3 years ago. Broke it off 6 months later when he realized marrying a horse trainer's daughter wouldn't advance his career. The village blamed me for being above my station, for putting on airs, for thinking I deserved better than I was born to. That's absurd. That's society." Clara met his gaze. "But yes, Your Grace, Callum, Victor can use that history against us both. The scandalous woman who seduced one man above her station, now targeting a duke. It's a compelling narrative. It's a fiction. Fictions are often more powerful than truth. You know that." Callum stood abruptly, began pacing the library with barely contained energy. "Victor wants me to fail, wants me to crumble under the pressure, to prove that grief makes me unfit. But failing means sending you away. Destroying Tempest, becoming exactly what my father was, cold, calculating, empty." He stopped in front of her chair, and Clara had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I won't do it," he said quietly. "I won't sacrifice what matters just to satisfy men like Victor and Hardwick. I won't become my father just because it's expected." The conviction in his voice made Clara's breath catch. She stood, needing to create distance before she did something foolish like reaching for his hand. "Then we'll show them," she said. "We'll show the council that Tempest can be reached, that your judgment was sound, that you're extraordinary," Callum finished softly. "That part won't be difficult. You've already proven it." The compliment landed like a physical touch. Clara felt heat climb her cheeks and forced herself to look away. "I should get back to work. Tempest will be expecting his afternoon session." "Clara." She paused at the door, heart hammering. "Thank you," Callum said, "for staying, for fighting, for believing this matters." She didn't trust herself to respond with words. She simply nodded and fled. Behind her, she heard him murmur something that sounded like, "For believing I matter." But that couldn't be right. Dukes didn't doubt their own importance, did they? The next 4 days passed in a blur of intensive training. Clara worked with Tempest from dawn until dusk, teaching him to trust human touch again, to accept a saddle without panic, to respond to commands with something approaching his former grace. The progress was real, but fragile. Some days Tempest seemed almost himself, intelligent, responsive, eager to please. Other days grief would wash over him without warning, and he'd retreat into the wild-eyed terror that had defined his months of mourning. Clara learned to recognize the signs. The way his ears would flatten seconds before panic hit, the particular quality of his breathing that meant he was remembering Edmund. She learned to give him space during those moments, to let him feel without demanding he perform. And slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice until it had already happened, the midnight episodes began to change. Tempest still called for Edmund at the stroke of 12, but the duration shortened, the desperation eased. And when Clara sat with him through it, speaking softly about loss and memory and the particular way grief ambushed you when you least expected it, the stallion would eventually come to her corner and rest his great head against her shoulder. Those moments undid her completely. Callum witnessed one such episode on the 7th night. Clara had thought herself alone in the stables when Tempest's cries began, but when she emerged from the stall an hour later, she found the Duke sitting on a hay bale in the shadows. "How long have you been there?" she asked quietly. "Since you started talking about your father's last words." His voice was rough. "About how he told you to be brave enough to choose your own path, even if it meant disappointing him." Clara's chest tightened. She'd been speaking to Tempest, not performing for an audience. The fact that Callum had heard those private admissions felt both vulnerable and strangely right. "Edmund said something similar to you," she said. It wasn't a question. Almost verbatim. The night before the accident. Callum stood, moving into the lamplight. He looked exhausted, shadows beneath his eyes, jaw dark with stubble, cravat loosened in a way that made him look younger, more human. He said our father had built a cage of duty and expectation, and I was the only one who could unlock it. I told him I didn't know how. What did he say? He said, "Start by saving something that matters more than appearances." Callum's smile was painful to witness. "I think he meant Tempest, or you, or maybe the parts of myself I'd locked away to become the perfect spare heir." Clara understood then, truly understood, why this horse meant so much to him. Tempest wasn't just Edmund's beloved animal. He was a test, a choice, a chance for Callum to prove he could be the man his brother had believed in rather than the Duke his father had demanded. "He would be proud of you," she said quietly. "Edmund, he'd be proud that you kept fighting for this." Would he? Callum moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines of strain around his eyes. "Or would he be disappointed that it's taking me so long to figure out what should have been obvious from the start?" "What's that?" "That some things matter more than titles and reputation and society's approval." He held her gaze. "That some people are worth any risk." The air between them felt charged with something dangerous. Clara knew she should step back, should maintain the professional distance she'd insisted upon. Instead, she found herself asking, "What people?" "You know the answer to that." Her heart was doing wild, reckless things in her chest. "Callum." "I know." He didn't touch her, but his voice was a caress. "I know all the reasons this is impossible. I know Victor is watching for any sign of impropriety. I know you have every reason not to trust aristocratic intentions. But Clara," her name on his lips felt like a revelation. "I can't keep pretending I hired you solely for your expertise with horses." "Don't," the word came out strangled. "Don't say something you'll regret when the council leaves and reality returns. The only thing I regret is not saying this sooner." Callum's hand lifted, hesitated inches from her face. "May I?" The request for permission nearly destroyed her. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. His fingertips brushed her cheek with devastating gentleness. "You are the bravest person I've ever met. You walk into stalls with dangerous animals and speak to them about grief as if it's the most natural thing in the world. You stand up to men who should terrify you and refuse to apologize for your competence. You see past titles and expectations to the person underneath." His thumb traced her jaw. "You see me, Clara, the real me, and you haven't run." "I want to," she admitted. "Every day I want to run because I know how this ends. You're a duke. I'm nobody. And when the crisis passes and you don't need me anymore, that's not going to happen. You can't promise that." "No," Callum agreed quietly. "But I can promise I'll fight for it, for you, for the possibility of something real in a world built on pretense and performance." Clara closed her eyes against the intensity of his gaze. "Victor will use this, whatever this is. He'll twist it into proof that grief has made you irrational. Let him try." "Callum, I'm not my father, Clara. I'm not going to sacrifice what I want for the sake of appearance." His hand dropped from her face, and she felt the loss like cold water. "But I won't push Won't demand. This has to be your choice too, and I need you to know whatever you decide, your position here is secure. I'll honor our agreement regardless. The fact that he was offering her an escape route, while simultaneously laying his heart bare, made Clara want to laugh and cry and kiss him all at once. Instead, she did the only thing her terrified, hopeful, impossibly confused heart would allow. "I need time," she whispered. "I need to think." Pain flickered across his face, but he nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He left her standing in the stable corridor, trembling with the weight of everything unspoken between them. Behind her, Tempest nickered softly, a sound almost like encouragement. "Don't you start," Clara told the horse. "You're supposed to be on my side." But when she returned to her quarters that night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay awake replaying Callum's words, his touch, the look in his eyes that promised both everything and nothing. She'd sworn never to let herself be vulnerable to an aristocrat again. Had built walls specifically to prevent this kind of hopeless, doomed attachment. And yet some treacherous part of her wanted to believe, wanted to trust that Callum was different, that what she felt building between them was real, and not just proximity and shared grief creating the illusion of connection. She was still wrestling with the question when dawn came, and another day of training began. Lord Victor struck on the 8th day. Clara arrived at the stables to find Tempest pacing his stall with agitated energy that immediately set off alarms. The stallion's eyes were wild, his breathing labored, foam flecking his mouth. "What happened?" she demanded of the stable hand hovering anxiously nearby. "Don't know, miss. Found him like this an hour ago. Wouldn't let anyone near." Clara's mind raced through possibilities. Colic, poisoning, some injury she'd missed yesterday? She approached the stall slowly, keeping her voice low and soothing. "Easy, boy. It's just me. Let me see what's wrong." Tempest's head swung toward her, but the usual recognition didn't come. He looked through her rather than at her, caught in some private panic she couldn't reach. She was about to enter the stall when she noticed something odd. A faint, acrid smell beneath the usual stable scents. Clara knelt by the water bucket and sniffed carefully. Bitter almonds. Just a trace, but unmistakable. Someone had put something in Tempest's water. Rage flooded through her, cold and clarifying. She straightened, turned to the stable hand. "Fetch his grace immediately, and don't let anyone near this stall until he arrives." The boy ran. Clara returned to Tempest, speaking continuously in low, steady tones, while her mind worked the problem. The dosage must have been carefully calculated, enough to make the horse appear dangerously unstable, but not enough to kill him outright. That would defeat Victor's purpose. He wanted Tempest to fail the council's demonstration. Wanted proof that the horse was beyond saving, that Callum's judgment was fatally compromised. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Callum appeared, still in shirt sleeves and hastily fastened trousers, his hair standing on end. "What's wrong?" "Someone poisoned his water." Clara kept her voice level despite the fury building in her chest. Not a lethal dose, just enough to make him violent and unpredictable. Callum's expression went stone cold. "Victor?" "Probably. Though proving it will be difficult." She turned back to Tempest, calculating. "We need to flush his system. Fresh water, walking, maybe some activated charcoal if you have it. I'll have everything brought immediately." Callum moved toward the stall door. "Can you manage him?" Clara looked at the panicked stallion, at the trust they'd built over the past week, now threatened by chemical manipulation. "I can try." She entered the stall with careful deliberation. Tempest shied away, but she matched his movements, speaking constantly, letting her voice become the anchor point in his drug-hazed reality. "Not your fault," she murmured. "Someone hurt you, but I'm here now. You're safe. I promise you're safe." It took 20 minutes of patient coaxing before Tempest allowed her to clip on a lead rope. Another 10 before she could guide him from the stall into the paddock. The early morning air seemed to help. Tempest's breathing eased fractionally, though his eyes still rolled white with residual panic. Clara walked him in slow circles, monitoring every tremor and stumble, adjusting her pace to match his limited capacity. Callum appeared with fresh water and the charcoal hovering at the paddock fence while she worked. "Will he be all right?" he asked quietly. "Physically, yes. But Callum, The demonstration is scheduled for tomorrow. Even if he recovers, he'll be weakened, unpredictable. She met his gaze over Tempest's heaving shoulder. Victor timed this perfectly. The council will see exactly what he wants them to see. Then we postpone. On what grounds? That you suspect sabotage you can't prove. That will only make you look paranoid. Clara's hands moved automatically over Tempest's coat, checking for other signs of distress. No, we proceed as planned. And we make absolutely certain Victor gets no opportunity to interfere again. How? I sleep in the stables. No one approaches Tempest without going through me first. She saw Callum's expression and added, "It's not about pride. It's about protecting the one piece of evidence that proves your judgment sound." And who protects you? The question caught her off guard. I don't need... Yes, Callum interrupted quietly. You do. Victor's escalating. If he's willing to poison a horse, what makes you think he won't target you directly? Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle herself. But the fear beneath Callum's careful control made her pause. He wasn't questioning her competence. He was terrified of losing someone else he cared about. Then you sleep in the stables too, she said. 2 witnesses are better than 1. Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with something warmer, more dangerous. People will talk. People are already talking. At least this way we'll know Tempest is safe. She managed a weak smile. Besides, it's only for 1 night. 1 night, Callum echoed. But the way he looked at her suggested he was thinking of far more than just guarding a horse. They spent the day nursing Tempest through the worst of the poisoning. By evening, the stallion had regained most of his equilibrium, though exhaustion had replaced panic. Clara got him settled in his stall with fresh water and feed, then turned to find Callum arranging blankets and lanterns in the stable corridor. I sent word that we're monitoring Tempest overnight, he said without looking up. Told the household not to disturb us unless it's an emergency. And Victor has taken several council members into the village for dinner. They won't return until late. Callum straightened, meeting her gaze. Which gives us a few hours without audience. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Clara knew she should maintain distance, should use this time to rest and prepare for tomorrow's demonstration. Instead, she found herself settling onto one of the blankets beside him, their shoulders nearly touching in the lamplight. Tell me about Edmund, she said quietly. The real Edmund, not the idealized version people create after someone dies. Callum was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he was terrible at dancing, absolutely hopeless, would step on his partner's feet and laugh about it instead of apologizing properly. Clara smiled. Your father must have loved that. Father was mortified, kept hiring dance instructors, insisting Edmund needed to master the social graces. Edmund would show up for lessons, then spend the entire time asking the instructor about their lives instead of practicing steps. Callum's voice softened with memory. He collected people's stories the way other aristocrats collect art. Wanted to know what mattered to them, what made them laugh, what they'd do if circumstances were different. He sounds wonderful. He was, and infuriating, and completely unfit for aristocratic life. Callum's hand found hers in the dim space between them. I envied him terribly. His ease with people, his ability to ignore society's expectations without apparent effort. I tried to be like him once, when we were younger. Failed spectacularly. What happened? A dinner party. I was 19, trying to impress a young woman by being charming and unconventional the way Edmund always was. Made some joke about the ridiculousness of formal dining protocols, 16 forks for 8 courses or some such nonsense. He grimaced. Father took me aside afterward and explained very clearly that spare heirs could afford eccentricity. Future dukes could not. I needed to comport myself appropriately, or risk embarrassing the family. Clara's fingers tightened around his. That's horrible. That's duty. Callum turned his hand to lace their fingers together properly. I convinced myself Father was right. That Edmund's way was charming because he'd never inherit the responsibility. That I needed to be the sensible one, the reliable one, the one who put the duchy before personal desires. And now? Now I'm Duke anyway, and Edmund is gone, and I realize Father was wrong about nearly everything that mattered. His thumb traced circles on her palm. He thought appearance was everything, thought duty meant sacrificing happiness, thought love was a luxury reserved for people without responsibilities. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. "Callum, I know I'm supposed to marry some appropriate aristocratic woman," he continued, his voice low and steady. "Someone with the right connections and breeding and training, someone who knows which fork to use and how to manage a duchy household and how to smile through misery with perfect grace. That's what dukes do. It's what my father did, and he died bitter and alone, respected by everyone and loved by no one." Callum shifted to face her fully. "I don't want that life, Clara. I want something real, something honest, someone who sees past the title to the person underneath." "You're asking for the impossible." "I'm asking for you." The words landed like lightning. Clara felt herself trembling, caught between terror and longing. "I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer you except scandal and complications, and—" "You offer yourself," Callum said simply. "Your strength, your honesty, your ability to reach broken things and make them whole again. That's worth more than any dowry or connection society could provide. Society won't agree. I don't care. You will. When the whispers start, when your peers turn away, when Victor uses me to destroy everything you've built." Callum kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and claiming and desperate, his hand cupping her jaw as his mouth moved over hers with the intensity of months of suppressed longing. Clara gasped against his lips, and he used the opening to deepen the kiss, tasting her with thorough attention that made her entire body sing. She should push him away, should remember all the excellent reasons this was a catastrophically bad idea. Instead, her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with equal desperation. The kiss ended slowly, reluctantly. Callum pressed his forehead to hers, their ragged breathing mingling in the space between them. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize." Clara's voice came out rough. "Don't you dare apologize for that." He laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "Then I'll simply say I've been wanting to do that since the first day you vaulted over that paddock fence and stood between me and certain death. That was only 8 days ago. 8 days that feel like 8 years. His hands framed her face with devastating tenderness. "Clara, I know this is complicated. I know Victor will use it against us. I know I'm asking you to trust an aristocrat when you have every reason not to. But please, please consider the possibility that this is real. That we're real." Clara closed her eyes, feeling tears burn behind her lids. "If I let myself believe that, if I let myself hope, and it ends the way it did before—" "It won't. You can't promise that." "You're right. I can't." Callum's thumbs brushed away the tears that had escaped. "But I can promise I'll fight for this with everything I have. I can promise that choosing you isn't weakness or delusion or impaired judgment. It's the sanest decision I've made since becoming Duke. The Council won't see it that way. Then the Council can hang for all I care." The crude vehemence made Clara laugh despite herself. Very ducal. "I'm trying a new approach. Edmund would approve." His smile faded into something more serious. "Tomorrow, whatever happens with the demonstration, I need you to know, my feelings won't change. Victor can expose us, the Council can condemn me, society can gossip until they're hoarse. None of it will make me regret this." Clara wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe. But experience had taught her that intentions meant little when measured against social pressure and consequence. "Ask me again, after tomorrow," she whispered. "After you've seen what choosing me actually costs." Pain flickered across his face, but he nodded. "After tomorrow, then." They sat together in the stable corridor until midnight, talking in low voices about everything except the demonstration looming over them. Callum told stories about Edmund's childhood pranks. Clara described her father's patient teaching methods and the horses that had taught her the most. When Tempest's midnight cries began, they entered the stall together. The stallion seemed calmer with both of them present, as if understanding on some instinctive level that his human grief had found company in theirs. Clara leaned against Callum's shoulder while Tempest's calls gradually softened into exhausted silence. His arm came around her solid and warm, and she let herself imagine, just for a moment, that this could be her life. that she could have both the work she loved and someone who understood why it mattered, that she could be chosen and kept instead of chosen and discarded. But imagination was dangerous, and tomorrow would bring reality in its cruelest form. The demonstration began at 10 o'clock under cloudless skies. Victor had assembled an impressive audience, the full council membership, several peers from neighboring estates, even a few society ladies curious about the scandalous horse trainer and her besotted duke. Clara stood in the paddock centre with Tempest, acutely aware of every watching eye. The stallion was recovered from yesterday's poisoning, but still fragile, his trust in her the only thing keeping him calm amid the crowd. Callum stood with the council members, his expression carefully neutral, but Clara caught the worry in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. He knew how precarious this was, how easily it could all collapse. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Brennan," Victor called from his position at the paddock fence. His smile was all aristocratic charm and hidden malice. "Please demonstrate the horse's newfound tractability." Clara took a slow breath. She'd planned a simple routine, basic commands, a demonstration of Tempest's responsiveness, perhaps a brief ride if he remained calm. Nothing flashy, nothing that would overtax the horse's recovering state. But as she moved toward Tempest with the saddle, she noticed something wrong. The stallion's ears flattened, his nostrils flared, that same wild panic from yesterday returning despite the fresh water and her careful monitoring. Someone had gotten to him again. Clara's mind raced. When? How? She'd been with Tempest all night except for the 30 minutes this morning when she'd left to change clothes and prepare. 30 minutes when only the stable hands supposedly had access. 30 minutes when Victor could have arranged for another dose of whatever substance turned a healing horse back into a dangerous one. She shot a glance toward Callum, saw understanding dawn in his eyes as he registered Tempest's behavior. This was the trap. Either she cancelled the demonstration and appeared to be covering failure with excuses, or she proceeded and risked disaster when Tempest inevitably lost control. Victor had outmaneuvered them completely. "Is there a problem?" Lord Hardwicke called. Pride made the decision for her. Pride and stubborn refusal to let Victor win. "No problem, my lord." Just giving Tempest a moment to adjust to the crowd. She approached the stallion slowly, reading every signal his body sent. Tempest was fighting the drug, fighting his own panic, trying desperately to trust her despite chemistry and fear overwhelming his capacity for reason. "I know," she whispered, too quiet for the audience to hear. "I know it hurts, but I need you to try. Please, boy, just try." Clara managed to get the saddle on, though Tempest's skin twitched and shuddered beneath the leather. Managed to secure the girth, check the stirrups, maintain the appearance of calm control while her heart hammered against her ribs. Then came the moment she'd been dreading. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung into the saddle. For 3 seconds, Tempest held steady. For 3 seconds, Clara thought they might actually succeed. Then the horse exploded. Tempest bucked with violent force, trying to dislodge the weight that his drugged mind interpreted as threat. Clara clung to the saddle, her thighs locked around his barrel, one hand fisted in his mane while the other fought to keep the reins. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. Clara heard Callum shout her name, but she couldn't afford to respond. All her attention focused on staying mounted, on reading Tempest's movements, on preventing the full breakdown that would doom them both. "Easy," she gasped. "Tempest, easy." The stallion reared, front hooves slashing air. Clara shifted her weight back, maintaining balance through instinct and desperate prayer. When Tempest came down, she was ready for the next buck, the spin, the series of violent attempts to throw her. She'd ridden difficult horses before, had broken in wild ones that fought every moment of training, but she'd never ridden anything like this, an intelligent, traumatized animal fighting his own nature under chemical influence. Tempest charged toward the paddock fence. Clara saw disaster approaching and made a choice. She threw herself from the saddle, hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, rolled through dirt and manure and pure survival instinct, while Tempest's hooves pounded past inches from her head. When she finally stopped rolling and dragged air back into her shocked lungs, She looked up to find Callum vaulting the paddock fence, running toward her with no thought for his own safety or ducal dignity. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Clara, speak to me. Are you hurt?" "Fine," she managed. "Wind knocked out, that's all." Behind them, Tempest had retreated to the far corner of the paddock, trembling and wild-eyed. The demonstration was over. The failure was complete. Victor's voice carried across the sudden silence. "Well, I believe that settles the question of the horse's stability, doesn't it?" Clara struggled to sit up, Callum's hands supporting her. She could see the council members conferring in low voices, faces grave, could see the society ladies whispering behind gloved hands, could see Victor's barely suppressed triumph. They'd lost. Despite everything, Victor had won. "The animal is clearly beyond help," Victor continued, addressing the council directly. "A danger to himself and everyone around him. My cousin's attachment, while understandable given the sentimental connection, has clouded his judgment to a dangerous degree." "That's enough, Victor," Callum said quietly. "Is it? Because from where I stand, we just witnessed proof that your decision-making capabilities are severely compromised. You hired an unqualified woman. Miss Brennan is the most qualified trainer in 3 counties, and insisted on keeping a violent animal that should have been destroyed months ago. Meanwhile, duchy business languishes because you're more concerned with a dead brother's horse than with your actual responsibilities." The words were calculated to wound. Clara felt Callum flinch, felt his hands tighten on her shoulders. She covered his fingers with her own, silently offering support. "Lord Victor has a point," Lord Hardwicke said reluctantly. "Your Grace, we all sympathize with your loss, but the Council has a duty to ensure the duchy is managed appropriately. And this situation—" He gestured at the paddock, at Clara sitting dishevelled in the dirt, at Tempest still panicked in the corner. "This cannot be characterized as appropriate management." "Then tell me," Callum said, his voice dangerously soft, "what would constitute appropriate management? Destroying an animal because his grief inconveniences me? Dismissing someone's expertise because her station makes you uncomfortable? Pretending I don't feel anything so society can maintain its illusions?" He stood, helping Clara to her feet and keeping her hand clasped in his. "My father spent 40 years being appropriate, being everything a duke should be. Duty above feeling, propriety above truth, image above substance, and it made him miserable, made everyone around him miserable." Callum's gaze swept the assembled crowd. "I won't become him. Not to satisfy the council, not to please society, not to maintain some fantasy that grief and love and messy human emotion can be managed away if we just follow the correct protocols. Your Grace." "I'm not finished." Authority rang through his voice now, the command of a man who'd finally decided which battles were worth fighting. "Victor wants you to believe that caring about Tempest, about Miss Brennan, about anything beyond duchy accounts and appropriate marriages is proof of instability. But I say the opposite is true." He turned to face the council members directly. "Instability is doing the same thing generation after generation while expecting different results. Instability is pretending humans can function like machines if we just suppress enough emotion. My father was the most stable duke in Northmore history. He was also alone, unloved and dead before 60, from a heart that gave out from bearing burdens he'd never learned to share." Silence fell over the paddock. Even Victor seemed momentarily thrown by Callum's vehemence. Edmund understood something father never did. Callum continued quietly. "That life without connection, without joy, without the messy complexity of caring about things beyond duty, that's not stability. That's slow death." He looked down at Clara, his expression open and unguarded. "Miss Brennan has done more to restore my capacity to function as duke in 8 days than all the council's careful management has done in 8 months. Because she reminded me that strength doesn't mean feeling nothing. It means feeling everything and choosing action anyway." Lord Hardwicke cleared his throat. "That's very stirring, Your Grace, but it doesn't change the fact that the horse is dangerous and your association with Miss Brennan raises serious questions about propriety." "Then ask your questions," Callum said flatly, "because I'm done apologizing for being human, done pretending nobility requires inhumanity, done sacrificing what matters for the sake of appearances." Victor's smile turned predatory. How noble. And when scandal destroys Miss Brennan's reputation, when society makes it impossible for her to work again, will your conscience be equally clear then? The barb landed. Clara felt Callum's hand tighten on hers, felt him waver. This was it. The moment when reality would inevitably prevail over intention, when Callum would recognize the true cost of choosing her and make the rational decision to protect his position instead. She'd seen it before, expected it, even understood it. But that didn't stop her heart from breaking when she felt him start to pull away. "Callum," she said quietly, "it's all right. You don't have to—" "Yes," he interrupted. "I do." He released her hand, and Clara braced for the rejection, the careful distancing that would let him salvage his reputation at her expense. Instead, Callum turned to address the entire assembled crowd. "I am in love with Clara Brennan." The words fell into shocked silence. Clara's breath stopped. "I love her competence, her courage, her refusal to accept easy answers," Callum continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was declaring. "I love the way she speaks to broken things with more gentleness than most people show functional ones. I love that she demands I be better than comfortable, more than adequate, greater than the sum of society's expectations." He turned back to Clara, and the expression in his eyes made her knees weak. "I don't know if that love is returned. I don't know if she can forgive aristocratic presumption after being hurt by it before, but I know I won't ask her to shoulder the consequences of my choice while I hide behind protocol and pretend this is just about a horse." "This is madness," Victor hissed. "Possibly," Callum agreed, "but it's honest madness, which I'll take over respectable hypocrisy any day." He dropped to one knee in the dirt beside Clara, took her trembling hand in both of his. "I can't promise this will be easy," he said quietly. "I can't promise society won't punish us both. I can't even promise I'll navigate all of this perfectly. But I can promise I'll choose you, Clara. Every day, every challenge, every impossible decision, I'll choose you. If you'll let me." Clara stared at him, at this impossible man kneeling in manure and dirt and the wreckage of his carefully maintained image, declaring love in front of the very people whose approval he needed most. Her father had taught her to recognize what was genuine and what was performance, and this raw, reckless honesty was genuine. "You're insane," she whispered. "Thoroughly," Callum agreed. "They'll destroy you." "Probably. Your reputation is built on foundations that needed destroying anyway." His thumbs traced her knuckles. "Clara, I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking if you'll let me try to deserve you." Tears burned hot down her cheeks. "I'm terrified. So am I. But Edmund once told me the only things worth having are the ones that scare you into being better than you thought possible." Callum's smile was painful and beautiful. "You scare me, Clara Brennan. You scare me into wanting impossible things." She should be sensible, should recognize that declarations made in front of witnesses carried weight, but also created pressure that could collapse under sustained opposition, should protect herself from potential heartbreak. But Clara was tired of being sensible, tired of protecting herself into loneliness, tired of believing she didn't deserve to be chosen loudly instead of hidden away. "Yes," she said. Callum's expression transformed. "Yes? Yes, you idiot. Yes, I'll let you try to deserve me." She pulled him to his feet, barely aware of their audience anymore. "And yes, I'll try to deserve you right back, even though you're completely insane and this is going to be impossibly complicated and—" He kissed her, right there in front of the council, and Victor and all of society's watching eyes, kissed her with fierce joy and relief and promise. When they finally broke apart, the paddock had erupted in chaos. Victor was arguing loudly with council members. Society ladies were fanning themselves with dramatic vigor. Lord Hardwicke looked torn between scandal and reluctant admiration, and in the corner of the paddock, unnoticed by the agitated humans, Tempest had stopped trembling. The stallion stood watching them with clear, intelligent eyes. The drug was wearing off. The panic had eased. And for the first time since Edmund's death, the great black horse looked almost peaceful. Clara saw it first. "Callum, look." He turned, following her gaze. His breath caught. Together, moving in unspoken agreement, they approached Tempest. The stallion didn't shy or bolt. He simply stood there, watching them with patient curiosity. Clara extended her hand. Tempest lowered his head and blew softly against her palm. Then slowly, carefully, he turned toward Callum. For 8 months, the Duke had tried and failed to reach his brother's horse, had been rejected and attacked and shut out by an animal too lost in grief to recognize anyone except Edmund. But now Tempest took 2 deliberate steps forward, pressed his velvet nose against Callum's chest, released a long, shuddering breath that sounded almost like release. Callum's hands came up to frame the horse's face with trembling reverence. "Easy now, boy," he whispered. "I know. I miss him too." Behind them, the arguing had stopped. Every eye in the paddock was fixed on the Duke and the horse and the impossible moment of connection. "That's not possible," someone said. That horse never let anyone." But Tempest was leaning into Callum's touch now, eyes half closed in contentment, accepting comfort from the man who'd fought so hard to save him. Lord Hardwicke stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Lord Victor, you claimed the horse was beyond help, that his Grace's judgment was fatally compromised." Victor's face had gone an ugly shade of red. "He was drugged. Someone obviously drugged the animal to create this performance." "You mean the way someone drugged him before the demonstration?" Callum said quietly, not taking his eyes off Tempest. "The way someone put poison in his water bucket yesterday, calculated to make him violent right when the council was watching." "That's a serious accusation. It's a fact, one I can prove if necessary." Callum finally looked up, his gaze hard. "But I'd rather not waste time on petty sabotage when I have actual duchy business to attend to, so here's what's going to happen, Victor." He straightened, one hand still resting on Tempest's neck. "You're going to return to London. You're going to inform the council that you were mistaken about my judgment, and you're going to stop interfering in my management of Northmoor Holdings. Or what? Or I'll have a very public conversation about where you were the night Father and Edmund died, about the debts you owed that conveniently disappeared after their deaths, about the fact that the carriage accident occurred on a road you specifically recommended they take." The colour drained from Victor's face. Around them, council members shifted uneasily. "You have no proof of anything," Victor said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "I have suspicions and resources and motivation to look more closely. Do you really want to risk what I might find?" For a long moment, Victor simply stared at his cousin. Then his gaze slid to Clara, and something ugly flickered across his face. "You're making a mistake. She'll ruin you." "She'll complete me," Callum corrected. "There's a difference." Victor turned on his heel and stalked toward the manor house. Several of his London friends followed, but interestingly, the council members remained. Lord Hardwicke approached the paddock fence. "Your Grace, that was unexpected." "Yes, well, I've had 8 months of meeting expectations. Thought I'd try something different." Callum's arm came around Clara's shoulders. "Gentlemen, allow me to formally introduce Miss Clara Brennan. He paused, looked down at her with tentative hope. "What should I call you?" "Terrified?" Clara suggested. "I was thinking more along the lines of betrothed, but terrified works too." The casual proposal made her laugh despite everything. "You haven't actually asked me to marry you, haven't I? I thought the public declaration of love and kneeling in horse manure covered the essential points. You might want to work on your romantic technique, Your Grace." His expression softened. "Does that mean you're considering it?" Clara looked at this impossible man, duke, mourner, fighter, fool, who'd chosen her in front of witnesses when it would have been so much easier to let her go. Looked at Tempest, peaceful now between them, a bridge between grief and hope. "Ask me again in 3 months," she said quietly, "after we've survived the scandal and you've seen what choosing me actually requires. I'll ask you every day until you say yes." Callum kissed her forehead. "Fair warning," Lord Hardwicke cleared his throat. "About the duchy business, Your Grace, the council would like to schedule—" "Next week," Callum interrupted. "I have a wedding to plan." "You just said 3 months. I'm an optimist." Clara elbowed him gently. To Lord Hardwicke she said, "Forgive him. He's not usually this insufferable. The love has made him drunk." "Love does that," the older man said, his expression unexpectedly kind. "My wife and I scandalized half of England when we married 40 years ago. She was a merchant's daughter. and I was a lord's third son. Everyone predicted disaster. And, Clara asked, we had 40 magnificent years before she died. Would make the same choice again without hesitation. He nodded toward Callum. Your Grace, if you love this woman as obviously as you claim, don't waste time proving it to society. Prove it to her every day. That's what matters. With that advice hanging in the air, the council members departed. The society ladies drifted away in clusters of excited gossip. And finally, Callum and Clara stood alone in the paddock with Tempest, surrounded by the wreckage of one future and the fragile beginning of another. We're going to be social pariahs, Clara said. Probably. Your peers will mock you. Let them. I don't have dowry or connections or the first idea how to be a duchess. Callum pulled her close, tucking her against his chest. Good, because I don't have the first idea how to be the kind of duke who deserves you. We'll figure it out together. Tempest nickered softly, as if offering approval. And for the first time in 8 months, Callum felt something shift in his chest, grief easing fractionally, making room for joy, for hope, for the terrifying possibility of choosing life over duty. Thank you, he whispered into Clara's hair, for staying, for fighting, for being brave enough to choose back. Thank you for seeing me, she replied, really seeing me. Not as a scandal or a problem or someone who needs saving, just me. Always, Callum promised. For as long as you'll let me. They stood together as the sun climbed toward noon, making promises neither was entirely sure they could keep, but absolutely certain were worth the risk of trying. Behind them, unnoticed, the stable door opened quietly. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Ridley stood in the shadows, watching the scene with an expression of mingled pain and wonder. Her son had chosen love over duty. Her dead son's horse had chosen healing over grief. And Margaret herself stood at the threshold, trying to find the courage to do the same. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Clara Brennan became the Duchess of Northmoor. The ceremony was small, held in the estate chapel with only family and close friends in attendance. Society had not been invited. The papers had written scandalized articles for weeks before finally moving on to fresher gossip. Victor had retired to his country house, his reputation damaged by quiet inquiries into his debts and movements the night of the carriage accident. And Tempest, fully healed and responsive, had been ridden to the chapel by the groom and stood witness as his late master's brother married the woman who taught them all how to grieve honestly. Now, with the vows spoken and the small reception concluded, Clara found herself standing in the stable yard with her husband, watching the late afternoon light gild everything gold. Nervous? Callum asked. Terrified, Clara admitted. I have no idea what I'm doing. Join the club. I've been duke for nearly a year and still feel like an imposter half the time. She leaned into his shoulder. At least we're imposters together. Best kind. They stood in comfortable silence until movement caught Clara's eye. Margaret emerged from the manor house, walking slowly toward the stables. She'd been avoiding the horses since the wedding planning began, old grief still too raw despite months of healing. Clara started to move away to give her mother-in-law space, but Callum's hand on her arm stopped her. Wait, he murmured. I think... Just wait. Margaret reached Tempest's paddock and stopped at the fence. The stallion, grazing peacefully, lifted his head and regarded her with calm attention. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Margaret's hand reached out, trembling, to rest on the top rail. I'm sorry, she whispered. The words carried across the quiet yard. I'm so sorry I couldn't look at you, that I blamed you for surviving when he didn't. Tempest moved closer to the fence, slowly, carefully, with the tentative trust of something that had learned to heal. You were his joy, Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. You and music and all the things I told him were frivolous. I was wrong. I was wrong about so much. The horse lowered his head over the fence rail, pressed his velvet nose against Margaret's outstretched palm, and the Dowager Duchess broke. She wrapped her arms around Tempest's neck and sobbed. Great tearing sounds of grief held too long, released too late, but somehow still reaching the only creature who could truly understand. Clara felt Callum's arm come around her waist, felt his own tears wet against her temple. They stood together, witnesses to healing, to the particular way love persists beyond death, beyond reason, beyond every attempt to contain it with propriety and protocol. When Margaret finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and swollen, and more peaceful than Clara had ever seen it. "Thank you," she said, unclear if she was addressing the horse or the universe or her lost son. "Thank you for staying, for being patient, while I learned how to remember without drowning." She looked across the yard to where Callum and Clara stood, managed a watery smile. "Edmund would be proud of you both, of what you've built here, of how you chose each other when it would have been easier not to." "Mother," Callum's voice caught. "No, let me finish." Margaret moved toward them, one hand still trailing along the paddock fence, as if needing the connection. "I spent 40 years married to a good man who never once asked what I wanted, who never questioned if duty and happiness could coexist. I thought that was normal, thought love was supposed to be quiet and convenient and carefully controlled." She reached them, placed one hand on Callum's chest and one on Clara's. "You're proving it doesn't have to be, that choosing each other, loudly and without apology, is worth whatever society thinks. And she swallowed. "I'm grateful you're showing me what Edmund always knew, that joy matters as much as duty, maybe more." Clara found herself pulled into an embrace, Margaret's arms around both her and Callum, three people bound by grief and hope, and the fragile belief that family could be built on love rather than obligation. When they finally separated, Margaret's expression was lighter than Clara had ever witnessed. "Now," the Dowager Duchess said, her tone turning practical, "I believe tradition dictates that you two should retire early from your wedding reception. Something about newlyweds and privacy and activities I don't need to know the details of." Callum laughed, the sound free and unguarded. "Subtle, Mother. I'm 63 years old. I've earned the right to be blunt." She shooed them toward the manor house. "Go, be happy. That's the only thing that matters." She turned back toward the stables, toward Tempest, toward the work of continued healing. And Callum and Clara walked hand in hand toward their future, scandalous, uncertain, and absolutely worth every risk. 5 months later, on a winter morning sharp with promise, the Duke and Duchess of Northmoor welcomed their first child. A daughter, dark-haired and loud and already showing signs of her mother's stubborn independence. Clara held her daughter against her chest, marveling at the tiny perfection of fingers and toes, and the way she'd already reduced a duke to helpless adoration with one scrunched-up cry. "She has your eyes," Callum murmured, perched on the edge of their bed like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter this fragile miracle. "She has her own eyes," Clara corrected, but her smile was soft. "Though I'll accept credit for the stubbornness she's already demonstrating." The baby, they'd named her Eleanor Margaret after no one in particular except that the name felt right, squirmed and fussed. Clara adjusted her hold, still learning this dance of new motherhood. A knock at the door preceded Margaret's entrance. The Dowager Duchess carried a small bundle wrapped in silk. "From the stables," she said quietly. "I thought Edmund would have wanted her to have this." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a tiny horsehair bracelet, delicately woven from strands of Tempest's black mane. It was beautiful and strange and absolutely perfect. "Mother," Callum's voice was thick, "you made this." "Tempest and I have been spending time together," Margaret said. "He's been teaching me about patience, about how healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means making room for both grief and joy." She placed the bracelet gently on the bedside table. "Eleanor should know about her uncle, should understand that some of the best people leave us too soon, but their love persists in unexpected ways." Clara felt tears burn hot down her cheeks. "Thank you. It's perfect." Margaret leaned down to press a kiss to her granddaughter's forehead. "Welcome to the world, little one. You're very loved and very, very blessed to have parents brave enough to choose each other, despite every reason not to." She left them alone with their daughter and the weight of all that love. Later, when Eleanor finally slept and the household had settled into quiet evening, Clara found herself drawn to the stables. Callum walked beside her, their hands linked, their steps matched in the easy rhythm of two people who'd learned to move through the world together. Tempest stood in his paddock beneath a sky full of stars. The stallion had aged gracefully in the months since the demonstration, still strong, still beautiful, but with a serenity that spoke of peace earned rather than given. He approached the fence when he saw them, his dark eyes gentle and knowing. "We did it, boy," Callum said quietly. "Survived the scandal, built something real, made Edmund proud, I hope." Tempest blew softly against Callum's palm, then turned his attention to Clara, nosing at the bundle she carried. "This is Eleanor," Clara murmured, adjusting the blanket so the baby's face showed. "Your newest person to protect." The horse regarded the infant with solemn attention, then, very gently, touched his velvet nose to Eleanor's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around a strand of his mane, and in that moment Clara understood what she'd been too scared to believe 15 months ago when she'd first stepped into that paddock. That healing wasn't about forgetting pain or pretending loss didn't matter. It was about making room for new love without diminishing what came before. Tempest had taught her that. Callum had shown her it was possible, and now they were teaching it to their daughter. This truth, that connection, chosen loudly and protected fiercely, could survive anything society threw at it. "The Duke's most dangerous horse obeyed no one," Clara said softly, remembering that first impossible day. Callum's arm came around her waist, until a quiet young woman stepped forward and showed us all that danger and wildness are just grief looking for permission to heal. That's not how the title went. No, but it's how the story ends. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thank you, Clara, for stepping forward, for staying, for teaching me that the bravest thing I could do was choose love over everything else. Thank you for being worth the risk," she replied. They stood together beneath the stars, Duke and Duchess, husband and wife, parents and partners, with a sleeping baby and a peaceful horse and a future they were building one brave choice at a time. The world would always have opinions, society would always whisper, but none of it mattered as much as this. The family they'd chosen, the love they'd fought for, the healing they'd earned together. And that, Clara thought as Callum guided her back toward the manor house, was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for staying with Callum and Clara's story until the very end. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose what our hearts know is right, even when the world tells us it's impossible. If their story touched you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story about people who dare to love loudly despite every reason not to. Your presence here, right now, listening to these words, is exactly why I keep telling stories about healing, hope, and the courage it takes to build something real.